wel donker, ja. Iets meer licht zou wel... Iets meer licht, ja. Dat zal fijn zijn. Sta ik aan? Ik sta aan. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Young Theologians panel on the theme of the conference, Negotiating Good Life in Times of Crisis. A well-chosen theme, I thought. It is as if you were foreseeing the fact that there would be a lot of crisis at the moment when the conference is being held. I would like to introduce the members of the panel. I'll start with the members which aren't going to be here. One of our members is going to be here online, Thandi Soko-de. She's a PhD candidate in the Beliefs Research Program of the PThU, and she is exploring intercultural theology, Jesus as a healer. Ruben van Zwieten, ordained minister, who has also majored in law and is working in the financial district close by, is not going to be here because he just tested positive for COVID. Unfortunately, we won't be hearing his contribution. But we have 3 people here, so that's very good. On my left is Amatina Lainen, former Theologian of the Year last year, Reverend in de Vrijgemaakt Gereformeerde Kerk. Author, lecturer, lived in and worked in South Africa for 10 years? 17. 16, okay. Are you that old? Or you start?
Very honored.
Okay, you started when you were 10. Right. Sitting next to you is Tabitha Van Krimpen. At the moment she's the Young Theologian of the Year. She majored in business administration and is currently enrolled in the theological master at the PThU, but hardly has any time to study, I think, because I see you everywhere participating in discussions and all kinds of interesting things. Very nice to have you here. And sitting next to me is Martijn Stoutjesdijk, postdoc researcher at the PThU, field of research, slavery and the church. And just telling me that you tick all the wrong boxes.
Yep.
But we're
almost.
almost all the wrong boxes.
I'm not old yet, I think.
Okay, but still, I'm very glad you're here. We're going to be, I'll introduce myself as well. My name is Elsbeth Grutek. I'm a theologian, historian, working in radio broadcasting and as a reverend. We're going to have 2 statements. For each of them will take about 45 minutes. Every participant will be given about 4 minutes to elaborate on the statement. And after all those statements by the speakers, we will have the possibility to have a discussion with you. And there will be someone walking around with a microphone, so you will be able to participate. And, give your own statement shortly, please, or ask a question. The 2 statements will be read aloud by me, and first we'll watch Thandi Soko-de, who has been recorded, and after that I'll give all the other 3 their turn to make their statements. The first statements we are going to discuss is times of crisis can put a positive perspective on life under pressure. Times of crisis can put a positive perspective on life under pressure. We'll watch Thandi Soko-de first.
Hello from Malawi, also known as the warm heart of Africa. I'm sorry I could not be with you in person today, as I'm here in Malawi conducting field research. I'm happy that I can join you through this video recording. Like the rest of the participants, I was asked to identify whether I agreed or disagreed with two very interesting statements. However, I approached binaries such as agree versus disagree cautiously. Thus, with the two statements, I keep an open mind that it is possible to agree and disagree, or to agree with neither, as I consider other possibilities of responding to them. Statement 1. Times of crisis can put a positive perspective on life under pressure. I think it depends on whether a person or a society is willing to consider a positive perspective in the first place. Often there is the pressure to avoid crisis, as if the power is in our hands to keep life orderly, safe, and cushioned from all disruptions. The impact of the recent pandemic, as well as major disruptions over the past decade in our politics, churches, climate, and society in general, have shown us that crisis can erupt at any moment, and our societies and theologies have been lacking in offering positive responses. With this in mind, if we ask whether it is true that times of crisis can put a positive perspective on life under pressure, the answer can only be yes if two things are acknowledged. First, we must acknowledge the vulnerability of our human existence, and secondly, we must acknowledge that our natural resources are limited. Acknowledging these two realities helps make room for positive perspectives and choices such as choosing hope in the midst of crisis, the pursuit of sustainability over zero-sum game attitudes, and ultimately the humility to consider learning from past crises and work together towards managing our fragile and vulnerable existence in better ways. Some theologies that inform this perspective draw on the image of the scarred, resurrected Jesus in John 20. In John 20, Jesus is described as having, on one hand, the power to overcome the ultimate marker of human vulnerability, death, and on the other, the choice to retain the scars of the wounds that have inflicted that condition on him. His example, I believe, offers us a model to live by, namely, that as we pursue stability and security from crisis, we must not detach ourselves from our precarious reality. We should hold whatever power we have in balance, with the understanding that we do not have ultimate control to shield our societies and the planet from all crises at all times. Perhaps only then can we say convincingly that times of crisis can put a positive perspective on life under pressure, because we'll be able to approach crisis as opportunities for positive learning and growth.
Speaking to us from Malawi, Thandi Soko-de Jong. Amatina Lainen, would you like to take the stand and elaborate on the...
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. I'm glad that it's possible to have this conference. Can you hear me well? Is it better like this? Okay. So it's wonderful to be here. I was struggling a bit with the first statement because I think you can read it in two different ways. I was just also speaking with Tabitha about it. Times of crisis can put a positive perspective on life under pressure, that it's the positive perspective that's under pressure, or you can read it like that a positive perspective on life that is under pressure. So I was a bit looking like, okay, what is the meaning? Is this the life under pressure, or is this positive perspective under pressure in times of crisis? And I assumed it's this last interpretation, so I will tell a bit about what I think on that, and I agree with the former speaker that I think it's interesting to elaborate on the whole idea of what is a positive perspective, and is that necessarily good to have a positive perspective, and how does that relate, for example, with notions like hope a very important Christian notion, and it's something else, I think, than just a positive perspective on life or the world, etc. In South Africa, where I lived for 16 years, I went there 17 years ago while I was studying theology. So indeed, I'm not that young anymore, but I'm glad I can be part of a young theologian panel. The life there was sort of constantly in crisis for lots of people because of poverty, because of violence, and it gave me, in the first time, a very negative perspective on life. It was, that's a South African accent. Here we have it, and it was overwhelming, and it made me negative. And then I realized, and it took me a long time, and theology and the Bible helped me with that. We will come to that on the next statement, but that it helped me to act and to search for justice, for poor people, for violence, etc. And I think that then I will stop now. I think life, your positive perspective can be under pressure, but that's not necessarily a negative thing, as long as you can find ways, although you're in despair and although you don't know all the time what to do, but if you can find ways to search for justice and to be with the poor and to be with the people that are in a very deep crisis, deeper maybe than yours, and be, try to be part of it and look for hope, I think that can definitely help, I think. So that's a small perspective from me on this subject, and I think my 4 minutes are probably over now. They told me there will be a sign or something.
Well, the sign is in the form of Henk de Roest.
Okay. Okay. Oh, wonderful. But I think I've said enough. I don't need any more time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Almatine Leene. Yeah, that's a very good idea. Tabitha van Krimpen, would you like to elaborate on the first statement? Times of crisis can put a positive perspective on life under pressure.
Well, thank you very much. Also very nice to be here amongst you. Also one of my teachers here, so that's also nice. I also discussed with Almatine that indeed the statement can be read in different ways. So I hope that I give a sufficient answer or reflection on the statement. Because I was also thinking about the positive perspective. And I think, yes, times of crisis can put a positive perspective under pressure, but is that a bad thing? I think that crisis can show, especially in the Western world, that life is not as makeable as we might want or as we think it is. Crisis reveals what is really important in life. The things that you thought were important go to the background, and the things that are really important, other people, relationships, religion, faith, these are the things that you can hold on to in crisis. And that's why crisis, yes, it challenges a positive perspective, but it helps you to raise questions that theologians in particular find very interesting. It helps you to ask questions about who am I? What do I find important? What is my goal in life? Why am I on this planet? What is the meaning of it all? Questions that help you reflect on the meaning of life and also on God, on religion, on something bigger than ourselves. So crisis helps, I think, to have a bigger perspective, to not focus on ourselves as individuals, as autonomous individuals, as we often think that we are, independent and free. But in times of crisis, we learn that we are ultimately connected to others, that we live by relationships, by connections, and that sometimes we are not as different as other people as we might think, that we ultimately have the same needs, the same desires, that we want the same things. And it also made me think of the Ubuntu theology from Desmond Tutu, in which he says that the community is so important. I exist because you exist, and together we live more fully also to the image of God, to the imago Dei, We are all created creatures, and we are all made in the image of God, and because of that, we are equal and we need each other. So, times of crisis can put a positive perspective on life under pressure, but I think positive perspective, I also think of the self-help guru that teach you, well, you think positive and then everything will be well in your life, or you follow my 7 steps and then you will be perfectly happy. But in times of crisis, you find out that it's not as easy as it sounds, and that life is more less black and white, and often has a lot of shades of grey. So times of crisis can put a positive perspective on life under pressure, but I think that that's an invitation for learning and seeing more of the world and of who we are. Thank you.
Thank you. Just one question. Would you say that we need crisis in order to learn?
I would not say we need crisis. I know that the psychiatrist Damian Denis has said we need a war to learn as a society what suffering really is. Mm-hmm. And then Corona came, so I think he underestimated that statement a bit. But no, I would never wish anyone a crisis.
No.
But yeah, also in my own life, looking backward, it also has an enriching effect, or helps you to understand life in a better and richer way.
Okay, thank you. Martijn Stoutjesdijk, for you to reflect on the first statement.
Yes, thank you. And good evening, everyone. I've decided to approach both statements from a different perspective. For the second statement, I will depart from my academic background, but for this first statement, I want to use some examples from politics, a field that I have some affinity with as a local politician. And now we all know that famous saying, never waste a good crisis, that is attributed to Winston Churchill. With that statement, Churchill tried to explain how the founding of the United Nations was only possible because of the terrors of the Second World War. And another example of a beneficial outcome of the First and Second World War might be the welfare state that we have in Europe. However, instead of seeing these examples as evidence for the statement that I have to respond to, I would like to develop the argument that a crisis is seldom a creative moment in itself, but it mainly helps to propel or accelerate a change or positive perspective that was already there. If you allow me, I would like to use the metaphor of giving birth that Soko-de also at times uses. I would argue that a crisis often works like a delivery. It helps to bring out things that were already there or weren't. A quotation from Milton Friedman, the famous economist that I'm not a huge fan of, but that's a side remark, might be illustrative. Quote, "Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable," unquote. Why is this important? Because recent history has shown that without viable alternatives, without good ideas laying around, without a child in the making, so to say, a political crisis is not much more than a moment that will pass but won't fundamentally change a thing. And recent examples of this are numerous. Did the financial crisis of 2008 change our banking and financial system? Answer should be no, in my view, aside from some details. Or even more recent and close to home, did the toeslagenaffaire, the childcare benefit scandal, change anything fundamental to our tax and benefit system? Did the earthquakes in Groningen change anything fundamental about the political treatments of the victims? My answer to all these questions is no, and hence my answer to the statement is no as well. Of course, a crisis can put a short-lived positive perspective on life under pressure, such as the relief supplies that so many Dutch have collected for the Ukrainian refugees, or the fact that so many have opened up their houses. However, the Syrian refugee crisis has taught us that the initial solidarity soon disappears and is taken over by irritation and complaints. To really change a situation, I argue, to really develop new perspectives, I think we as academics and theologians have an obligation to continuously think about the structure of our world and society and to come up with courageous ideas that might feel impossible or even unthinkable now, but when the next crisis comes, will be exactly what we need. And in this sense, I would like to connect my response to this morning's lecture by Iris Veerbeek, who spoke about a crisis of imagination, the lack of ability of imagining alternative, sustainable, and I would like to add, and just futures. There, I would like to argue, lies our role and responsibility for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, all three, and also Thandi, Soko-de, Jong, for your reflections on the first statement. I would like to give the audience the opportunity to ask questions, give reactions, and I would like to ask you to do that in a short statement or question. And there's somebody going to walk around with a microphone, so if you just raise your hand if you want to say something, then somebody will come to you, and he will keep the microphone for himself, but he'll help you to ask a question.
You must forgive me if this is not very clearly formulated because it's just
fine.
growing in my mind. I have traveled a lot in this part of the world, and I was amazed at what the two women said first, because so quickly talking about not being alone, not thinking of yourself alone, but of the community, is that a new phenomenon because of the crisis that Europe has gone through, the whole world, of course, is going through? Because I was surprised how well you both articulated that we are not alone in this, and that we can't just come out of this by ourselves. We have to think of the community around us. So for me, it was, it's very welcome, but I wanted your remark as to where did this come from?
Have we suddenly discovered community?
Yes.
That's your question. Thank
Yes.
you. Well, Amatina, you mentioned the community, and so did Tabitha. So,
Thank you. I can only speak for myself, and I think it definitely helped when I stayed in South Africa. In the first years, I was very lonely. I had no money, I didn't know anybody, and it was my relationship was over at very, very bad times. And I think that helped me, my personal crisis, because it was quite a crisis, really helped me to understand that I indeed am not a person to be on my own and live for myself. And it was part of the crisis that I was so lonely. And in the years that came when I was more part of a community, and it took me a lot of energy. I felt like this is what when I have more energy myself, and I also want to do that for others. So it was part of my own personal crisis, I think, to realize that, but also theology and Desmond Tutu and a lot of African theology, but also I think somebody like Jürgen Moltmann inspired me with that, the whole idea of the Trinitarian God. I did my PhD about being made in the image of God, and then the triune God was, what does that mean for us being human, and the whole discussion of the position of women in the church, and that we need each other as different genders. And I think that helped me, and also I learned that we have all personal crises, and we have bigger crises, but there's always somewhere a crisis. So it's not something that is sort of new or unique, and just try to help in some way or just be there. I think, maybe that will help. But thank you for your observation.
Tabitha,
Yeah.
have we discovered community in the recent crisis, for instance, in the recent COVID crisis?
No,
Had we forgotten something, or?
I don't think so. For myself, it's the Christian tradition that keeps telling me that we need each other, that we need community, that we are not made to be alone. No, it's not something that was invented yesterday. But I think in society we also see more and more the negative side of only focusing on the individual. We live in a country in the Netherlands where 40% of the people form a one-person household, which is only increasing. And that doesn't mean that people are lonely, but loneliness is a big problem amongst elder people, but also amongst students and my generation. That was before the corona crisis, this was already a problem, but now in the corona crisis this only has increased and also has increased the awareness around the issue, where students had to have education online and were in their tiny rooms, student rooms, and figured out, well, is this the big world that I was dreaming of a few years ago? So this issue is keep getting more urgent, and I think that we need community now not more than ever, but very much, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Martijn, would you like to add something to the?
Yeah, perhaps. I was wondering when listening to you whether it is right that we have rediscovered communities, because what I see with COVID, for example, is that there was indeed a surge of solidarity actions. There was a newfound belief in helping each other and things like that. But it all dissipated rather soon after, half a year, maybe a year. And I'm not so sure whether we have entered a new age. I don't want to be pessimistic here in this panel, but
well, so far you're succeeding.
Apparently, that is my role. What we also see is that we have seen an acceleration of mechanism in capitalism in which you can order even more at home, so that you don't have to leave the house anymore for whatever reason. So I'm not so sure about this new community thinking approaching or entering our age.
No, but maybe Amatina and Tabitha, you could say something about whether you are speaking about the desire for community or whether you're really seeing it appearing.
I agree with Martijn. I'm also not that positive. I'm a leader of a congregation of 1,000 people, and I see a lot of individualism, and there are lots of people are family and they have their small communities, but it's very difficult for people that come from outside and to be part of it. And I agree with Tabitha that I think church is learning to be a community, and as a leader I try to show what that can be, and that you can share it, and the more you share maybe your family or the things you have or the community with everybody, the more fulfilling it is. Because I also see lots of people that have big families or are very satisfied, that they're in a way are unhappy, and that's interesting. So I think you can have everything and be very unhappy, and there comes this deep understanding of that we are human beings made for community, but not only communities like with your own family, your own people, but the challenge to face the other, who is maybe very other, and have meetings, and I think that's a big challenge. But it's a very fulfilling challenge. So that's why I believe in that and try to get people motivated to do that and go outside and don't be afraid for other people, how different they maybe are, and face them and have a conversation and look for what you have in common. And that's quite a lot. So there's an anxiety I think we must just acknowledge and just must speak about, and then we can come quite far, I believe, but it is not an easy job.
it's a challenge in our society. Yeah. Can we go to maybe to the next statement or question from our audience? Yeah, I can see some.
Oh, I want to ask another question about community. Is that okay? I want to know how you think definitions of community have changed in the last 4 or 5 years, and whether they have helped community as we understand it theologically, or hurt community. Just one more sentence. I can't count on students in a classroom to prioritize the community of the classroom anymore over the community they carry around on their iPad. And should I?
So how has the definition of community changed? Yeah, that's the main question. Yeah, which of you would like to?
Maybe not so much on the academic development, but the last point you also touch upon the technological developments and how that impact our understanding of community. And I think that is indeed very influential, especially in the last decades. That also when you speak about being connected with someone, that's more than a Wi-Fi connection or an internet connection with someone. And companies like Facebook also have a mission to connect the whole world, but that's especially, foremost in their own benefit, and only then in the benefit of the community and really being connected with each other. And also on Twitter, for example, there are communities, but are that also the people that you can rely upon when crises emerge or when life becomes difficult? I don't necessarily think so. So that's also a very different understanding of community, where it's not so much the physical embodiment of community, but more the technological and connections with people all around the world that you can share a particular interest with or a hobby or those sort of things, but not in a community where it previously might be more that you are given to each other, that you lived with people in a community that you had to deal with in your normal life. That is now less the case. So that's maybe my word.
Does it have to do something as well with choosing your community? That maybe online you have a choice of who you want to be a community with, and in maybe a church or another kind of community you are given to each other.
And when I reflect on that, I think that church, it is my vision that church is the place where you meet people that are so different than you are. And I cannot think of other places where that is the case nowadays. And I see, when I go to the supermarket, I see the students, I see them go to the self-scan checkout. And they don't have to speak to anyone. And when they do have to speak, they are surprised, or they seem to have headphones in and are talking to other people. And I sometimes miss the local community, that you are grounded somewhere and building up a community together. Yeah.
Anyone else would like to react to the question? Or
yeah, I think it has negative sides, but also positive. I mean, if I think about my time in South Africa 17 years ago, when I was so lonely, I mean, it was very difficult for me to speak with my parents. I needed to walk to the next petrol station and then have that number and SMS my parents, and we can speak for 10 minutes, that's it. And if I see how my husband, who is a South African, now we stay in the Netherlands now for the last year and a half, how he connects all the time with friends from South Africa, just with an easy phone call and sometimes for hours. And it does not keep him away from building a new community here, but it can really help him to stay connected with people who know him very well, and with his own culture. And so I think that's the positive side of it. So I think it's important to see social media as an instrument and try to no less and no more, and that it's that it can have a positive side, but also a very negative side, and it's a challenge to get that balance. Sort of, how can we use that as lecturers, as ministers, as students, but also try to have a stop on that and just see see where it gets negative.
All right. Next question, Elaine.
I found it interesting that the only man in the panel used the metaphor of delivery for a crisis. So I am curious, how do the women in the panel think about it? Can you affirm that
If we
metaphor?
agree.
Let me, I gave birth to 3 children, and the last one was a year and a half ago, so as soon as you spoke about that metaphor, I saw myself giving birth to the last one and thought, oh, yes, that was really hard. And I think it's interesting to use that metaphor, and one of my questions was actually to elaborate on that, because you used it very short, like it needs to happen, sort of. So that first, before I react on that more fully on the metaphor, I think it would be interesting to hear from you where you think are all the lines.
Well, hand the microphone over to Martijn, and he can explain himself.
Yeah, so I should have checked it with my wife. No, but I also always find the metaphor of Socrates very attractive, and also because he described his own role in it, or no, not so much his own role, but he compared his own role to that of a midwife, and his wife, according to tradition, was a midwife. So the metaphor that he uses is that a philosopher helps to bring out wisdom, to bring out something new, and that it is already there. It is already, for example, hidden in you, in us. There's a conversation in one of the dialogues from Plato, where he speaks with a slave, and his point is that also a slave has knowledge, also a slave has insights, but you have to have a good teacher, a good midwife to deliver that wisdom. But it's not an easy thing to do. You have to go through a lot of ordeal, and you have to help each step of the way, so to say. So, but that's the way Socrates uses it, and I also explicitly refer to Socrates. Fortunately, I did, I would say. So of course, this is not my own experience.
No, we understand. It's quite clear. Now you've changed. You've changed from the woman giving birth to the midwife, so that's the very safe way. Thank you. We'll let you go. We'll let you off now. I have a.
Can I
Okay.
And I'm actually very curious what you think about it. We had last in the politics also one of the people that used that exact same metaphor to say after the whole. How do you call it? The political after the elections, the new cabinet and everything. And there was also some critique, like how can you use that metaphor? I think there are better metaphors, like seed in the ground, that you want to grow and come up, or etc. I think, but it is indeed interesting. I think there are lots of things that come in my mind, and I'm not sure if that's...
Maybe you should lay this metaphor to rest.
Yes. Well, but I'm interested how, why the question, and why what you think of it, Elaine.
Okay, I had my doubts because from my experience, delivery, even when it's hard, it is full of expectation, and you know that the pain and the crisis is good for something, that hopefully something good will come out. But when you are in the middle of a crisis, like a war, then you don't have such expectation. Then it's a destruction, just a destruction, and not, oh, but this is necessary because now something good will come out of it. If you are in the middle of a crisis, I think it does not feel like a delivery. So that would make me very cautious about using the metaphor. Perhaps after the experience, as an interpretation of the experience.
50 years later, you are
For
allowed,
instance,
you're allowed to use the metaphor.
If something good has come out of it, or if you were able to build up society again, then,
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I have one last question before we go to the next statement. One of you mentioned some theologians who inspired you in your thinking, but maybe you could elaborate a bit on the inspiration. Where do you get your inspiration from on thinking about crisis and the good life? Could you share a bit of that with us? Or is it too? Yeah.
Well, I mentioned already Jürgen Moltmann. For me, he is definitely inspiration, especially now in war times. He was 16, I think, when he lived in Germany, and the city was bombed where he lived, and a friend of him died next to him, and so that was a crisis. And then he went to Belgium and was imprisoned there. And I think his whole theology and starting from hope and the crucified God and the God of hope in crisis. And what inspired me from him is that he mentions also some Bible stories and his own life. So it's very, I think it's very lived theology, what I also like. And he says all the time, like, when there's a deep crisis, there will always be a new thing. And to believe that. And I think that helps me. You don't know how, if everything will come right, you know, and what is then a good ending. But he uses a frame in one of his books. He says, in the end, the beginning. So sometimes we need an end for a new beginning. And that's not nice, and it's hard. But with God, there will always be a new beginning. And I have no idea how it looks like, but I believe that there will be. So that inspires me still in handling crisis or give people hope. And I think give people hope is really, and not only in this life. I think that's always looking for a balance in that as well. Like, is it, and I find that a challenge in our times, especially in the West, where we have actually quite a good life and a very good life comparing to other parts of the world. And we're so focused on the here and now. And in theology, I think that's a good thing in a way. I mean, you have a Dutch song like "Stil maar, wacht maar, alles wordt nieuw." It's like be quiet and easy. Everything will be new one day. But I think that's a wrong approach. I think the approach is that we must, like Moltmann also did, like fight for justice and believe that we can make a difference. But still, on this earth, I think we will never get it right, and we must have that realistic view as well, and make that a bigger eschatological picture. So that's where my inspiration comes from.
Maybe you can hand over. Yeah, I'll just finish this round and then we'll go to the next statement.
I can also answer your question. I was thinking of Tish Warren, an Anglican priest, who's also a big inspiration for me.
Giving birth, very important for her.
Yeah, and her recent book is Prayer in the Night, where she describes the experience of having a miscarriage and being in the hospital, and at the moment when there's despair and everything seems lost, she and her husband pray Compline prayer, and her book and also her personal spirituality shows that when you don't have the words yourself in times of crisis, there are other words, other people's words from the rich Christian tradition, from prayer, that can sometimes say it better than you at that moment. And in the book she she discusses the whole prayer and also speaks about where is God in the suffering and in this world. And without giving definite answers, she also leaves room for the mystery that God is, and helps to provide language. And for me personally, also the language touches upon a deeper level, and something of a soul dimension, as I might call it. So for me, her book is a very big inspiration. Yeah.
Thank you. Martijn?
Yeah, that was a difficult question for me, but I have been thinking, and when I will stick to the politics, because that's also where my statement was dealing with. And I was thinking about one book that made a big impression on me. That was the book of Karl Popper, Open Society and Its Enemies. And what that book argues for is that you shouldn't strive for big revolutions because they're very bloody. It's quite a mess with a big revolution. But what you want to have is a step-by-step transition of society to with each step on the way to a more just and open and good society. And I think that's also an important lesson when we're speaking about crisis, that especially when we are talking about war, for example, that crises often go along with a lot of cruelty, violence, pain, etc. And that's something Karl Popper warns us for.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. I think it is now time for our second statement. And we'll do it more or less in the same way. We'll start with Thandi Soko-de Jong, from speaking to us from Malawi. I'll read the statement for you. In a time of crisis, the Bible guides me, my community, people in our society, in making just decisions. In times of crisis, the Bible guides me, my community, people in our society, in making just decisions. That's the statement we'll be talking about for the next 45 minutes. And we would like to start with Thandi Soko-de Jong.
Statement 2. In a time of crisis, the Bible guides me, or my community, or people in our society in making just decisions. This statement strikes me as attributing a guiding power to the Bible that is not present often enough in major theological traditions today. Saying that something guides you requires that you accept that a particular entity is worth taking guidance from, guidance that you're willing to apply to yourself. However, when was the last time you observed such a posture in many of our Christian theological traditions around the world today? In my observation, there's more pressure to interpret the Bible as a way of coming up with abstract concepts. There is far less pressure to seek guidance that leads to the sort of changes we may not just want, but also need. Thus, when it comes to making just decisions in times of crisis, how can it be possible to be guided by the Bible when we approach it with the intention of interpreting its passages to fit abstract themes that tend to satisfy our own or our respective societies' concerns, needs, and interests? Issues of justice tend to be concrete ones that call for action if we are to challenge corrupt systems and realize change. We cannot ignore injustice. Justice is integral to the Christian faith, as the term mishpat, which is associated with justice, appears 400 times in the Bible. This is more instances than other key terms like charity, which tend to dominate theological responses situated in contexts of power, affluence, and influence. Perhaps some necessary questions in response to the second statement are: can the powerful accept guidance on justice from the Bible? If so, how may they respond to passages that are critical of the injustice inflicted by the powerful, such as those stated in Psalms 10, or justice as God's requirement of us in passages like Micah 6:8, and God's desire that the oppressed be set free as offered in Luke 4, verse 18. Perhaps the answer lies in approaching being guided by the Bible as a call for the powerful to act justly in response to passages such as these.
Powerful statement from Malawi, one could say. Martijn, would you like to take a stand and elaborate on the second statement?
Yes, thank you. Before I answer this statement, I would like to mention that since 2 months I work as a postdoc researcher studying the role of the churches in the Dutch slavery past. And in my research I focus on the use of the Bible and exegesis in either advocating or critiquing slavery. So for my answer to this question I would like to depart from a defining atrocity in human history, the transatlantic slave trade and slavery. Now we might wonder whether slavery and slave trade can be characterized as a crisis. According to Wikipedia, or often a good source of course, a crisis is, and I quote, any event or period that will lead or may lead to an unstable and dangerous situation affecting an individual, group or all of society. Crises are negative changes in the human or environmental affairs, especially when they occur abruptly with little or no warning, unquote. Well, I think I do not need much time to argue that the transatlantic slavery has led to dangerous and negative changes for the people involved. Having established this, our question is then whether the Bible has guided people to making just decisions during this crisis. And I cannot but answer that question with a firm no. With regard to the transatlantic slavery, we are often being told that a society without slavery was simply unthinkable at the time, and that we shouldn't judge 17th and 18th century Christians from today's perspective. However, when the Dutch encountered slavery in the late 16th century, a lively debate arose among theologians about the permissibility of slavery, in which the Bible, of course, played an important role. Among theologians of those times, for example, the famous Udemans in the Netherlands, there was an awareness that all people were created in God's image, according to the Bible, and that slavery or servitude is thus against nature, as he wrote. These were biblical concepts argued for with the help of texts from the Bible. However, the same Udemans, and with him the majority of Dutch theologians, chose to emphasize different biblical texts about, for example, the curse of Ham, Genesis 9, or that slaves should obey their masters like they should obey Christ, Ephesians 6 verse 5. But be aware, while slavery became permitted in the colonies on the basis of these exegetical reasonings, slavery still wasn't recognized on European Dutch soil, with as a consequence that if you came from, for example, and this is paradoxical, Suriname with your slave became automatically free after some time on European soil. So please don't tell me Christians of those times couldn't think of a world without slavery. They could so for their own country in the Netherlands, but weren't willing to do the same for the people that were far away, accumulating wealth for the Dutch nation. Now we could ask an even more fundamental question, that is whether the Bible, when one would add up all passages on slavery, is a good source to rely on at all, when one would want to argue against slavery. Formulated differently, were the 17th century theologians to blame when they defended slavery on the basis of the Bible? The Mexican professor Hector Avalos thinks not. He writes, and I quote, "Reliance on biblical ethics generally has delayed the abolition of slavery and any progress towards freedom. Any credit to the Bible for ethical advances of slavery and any credits to the Bible for ethical advances concerning freedom is usually the result of arbitrary exegesis of the Bible, reinterpretation, and abandonment of biblical principles," unquote. While I'm not at all certain that I totally agree with Avalos, I do know that the statement that the Bible will help making just decisions in times of crisis is in various ways a very problematic statement.
I still have a post-COVID cough, so I'm sorry. Thank you very much, and very well within the time. Yes. Tabitha, can I ask you to elaborate on the second statement, please?
Yes, so the statement is, in times of crisis, the Bible guides me, my community, or people in society in making just decisions. And I was thinking about the statement and also about how the Bible can guide us. And I think that when reading the Bible, it is full of stories of people in crisis. People who are oppressed, who are abandoned, who live under an oppressor. And Ruben van Zwieten can't be here, but I think that he will agree that the Bible is a story also of liberation, of exodus, of going to a freed land. And the Bible also helps in its stories to have a grip on life. It helps to hold on. It helps to deal with death, with suffering, with all those elements and experiences that are intrinsically human and that we all deal with one way or another. And I think also that the Bible is full of failing people who try to walk with God, to follow his way, but who fail to do so often, and who reach the limits of their own being, of their own capabilities. I also think of the book of Alain Verheij, Ode aan de Verliezer. I could translate it as Triumph to the Loser. And he shows by all this different sorts of biblical stories that it's often the loser in the Bible that turns out to be the hero. And maybe what happens on the cross is the biggest example of that through what seems as losing or dying on a cross turns out to be the biggest victory of human history. But at the same time, there are no easy answers in the Bible. So when we look at the second part, making just decisions, there are no clear-cut answers, I think, in the Bible. But we do need tradition and religion to give a broader perspective. And it also helps us to come out of our own temporal and contextual view sometimes, where we think that the way that we look at the world is universal and applies to all of us. But at the same time, the Bible can be estranging. Some of the biblical stories, you wonder, why is it even there? What is the meaning of it? How can we apply it to the 21st century? And also thinking about just decisions, you inevitably have to speak about ethics. And last weekend I was at the theater show of the PThU about dementia and euthanasia, very relevant topic. And there was a theater show about these topics where also I and the other people of the audience had to engage in a conversation about what do you think that is ethically just? Who has to say something when it is about life and death? And it's good to have these conversations. And theology also has a normative component in it to look at these issues, these ethical issues. But at the same time, asking questions is also a very theological and academic endeavor. And we don't always have to have the answers, but strive for the conversation and then have an open mind in it. So in times of crisis, the Bible guides me and the people in society making just decisions. I think yes, but it's always a way of looking, searching, and in the hopes of finding what those just decisions are. And I cannot help you with the definite answer, but I hope we can do that together on that journey. Thank you.
Thank you. So community is back once again. Amatina.
Thank you. Interesting statement. I think, again, it's for myself. I mean, the question is asked if it guides me. I think in personal crisis, the Bible actually plays a very important role in guiding me. I think that's I don't know, I realize now in a bigger crisis that I find it more difficult to find the Bible as a guide, because it's way bigger and people see it differently, and then I find the Bible many times sort of stand in the way almost to look for hope in the crisis, because you can also use it as a guide to get your own rights, or I mean, I've seen it in the Corona crisis that the whole book of Revelation, for example, how people used certain passages from that book to get people more anxious than they already were, and I think that's quite dangerous. So I struggle more with sort of public crisis to use the Bible as a guide than in personal crisis. Then I find it more easy to get my hope and my path through life and make decisions, although I don't see the Bible as a book that sort of tells me exactly what to do, but it helps me, the stories of different people and the shout out to God and the hope. But indeed, like Tabitha already said, like the Bible is a book full of crisis, so I think that helps me, and I think that can help us to sort of relativate our crisis, that it's not new. I teach in church history as well, and I find it very important that we know our church history also as part of history and not only the Bible, because it helps to see that crises are part of all times and that nothing is new. And so in that way it helps me, and also the community I think can be dangerous, and on the other hand it can be helpful to do things together, because on our own it's difficult, but it's also difficult if you see the community has a certain point of view and you feel that's maybe not the right thing in these times, and how do you stand up then and how do you react on that. And I find it interesting what Thandi said about making just decisions, because she made the connection with doing justice, and I think that's very important, because you can make just decisions, but what is then just? Maybe for yourself and you feel good about it, or you think that's the right thing to do. But justice is, like she said, it's about the other, and it can be just for yourself, but maybe not just for the other. And there comes the word justice in. So I think that's good, and indeed also just a realistic view of life, that we can't get it all right, and in the Bible I find also the screaming to God and the cry for help from above, from God, that He is the one who did justice in Christ and will do justice. And I think it definitely helps us to think about that side of God as well. And I think in the Netherlands we struggle with that, and it's good to think about it, and to think about God who does justice, and what does that mean for us? How do we look to justice then as well? Thank you.
Thank you, Amatina. It's clear that none of you have a clear-cut answer, but maybe that's part of being a theologian. Are there any questions, statements from the audience? There's somebody going to walk around with the microphone.
Yeah, thank you. I'm studying about human trafficking, and human trafficking recognized as modern slavery. And in Indonesian context, slavery in Indonesian context has root in Dutch colonial time. And Dutch colonial time has close relation with evangelism. And evangelism has close relation with the Bible. And in the Bible, a lot of story about slavery. And sometimes it makes me confused. Even church that I know, Pastor Collar, white collar, is based on slavery history in the Bible. But now it's difficult to encourage church in Indonesia to speak about modern slavery. Because when they read the Bible about slavery, and their hermeneutics, it will be slavery from sin, slavery from God. It's like transcendent of slavery. But it's difficult to encourage them to see, if you believe to God who redeems the Israel from slavery, it means you also have to fight for the victims. That's why I want to ask, why a lot of story in the Bible about slavery, but it's difficult to end human trafficking now? Thank you.
very sorry. Maybe your subject?
Yeah. Thank you very much for this perspective that I recognize. And this is a very old thing that you describe, actually. For example, I'm working on Jacobus Kapitein from the 17th century, and he also makes a difference between spiritual slavery and the physical slavery, and then he focuses on the spiritual slavery. That's the important thing. But for me, to be a church that gives about, that cares about justice, it's also about the very material slavery that we encounter in our contemporary society. For example, the human trafficking that you described. So I completely agree with you.
Thank you. Another question.
Thank you very much for your politically correct answers in using the Bible. That means I fully agree. That's what we teach. But what worries me, and I'm curious about your reaction as young theologians, your view is not the view that is shared by many young people. We know it from older people, they're very conservative, but many young people say, well, because the Bible tells me so, and they have very clear normative answers. How do you react to that? How can we react to that? Should we react to that? I'm curious about your way of coping with that, for me, crisis in the use of the Bible.
Thank you. That also worries me, so I can fully understand what you're saying. That people especially in times of crisis, I think lots of people look for security, and then religion is actually a very, I would almost say, easy thing to hold on and say, but as God says it, and as the Bible tells me so, then that's true, and whatever you say, that's how it is. But I think it gives a fake security, and in conversations I always try to sort of ask questions about the need for security, and I think it's a very human thing to want that, to know exactly how things are. But it is part of life that we don't know, and it's actually part of belief that we don't know everything for sure, and that we don't have to. It's about trust and about relation. But I think religion many times is the opposite of that, and that people find their all their security in that. So in my congregation and with my students, I try to ask sort of soft questions, because it asks also, I think, some pastoral care, and I mean it's definitely not helping if you just say like, listen, but that's nonsense or whatever. So I try to challenge that and ask about their fears, and ask about the base of their faith, and how they see that, and what to do if people think differently, and can we then together read the Bible and trust each other also. And so I find that a big challenge, but I think it is definitely possible to have conversations about that in a very respectful way, and understanding where it comes from. That helps me, just to understand where it comes from, that people want security, and that's normal and that's understandable, but I'm afraid it's not it does not give the real security, and the real security then is more insecure. But I think it's helping all of us more to acknowledge that we're. To speak with the words of the Night Bride, we're all a little bit lost sometimes. I think that's Night Bride. If you don't know her yet, you will find her on the internet.
Tabitha, coming from the generation being talked about, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, and also personally I was brought up with the idea that you read the Bible in a certain way, and if you don't, then you take you don't see the Bible as authoritative, or you don't take the Bible seriously. And studying theology has also helped me to see the diversity of perspectives that are possible of looking at the same text. And my bachelor thesis was about Augustine's reading of Genesis 1 and 2, and to see how he already sees different layers of allegory, of literary interpretation, to see also in the debate about creation versus evolution, that there are different views that are not, and the one is not less biblical than the other. And I also see a big role there for you as teachers and for the institution, for the education, to facilitate the conversation about this, because. And I also see that that's a big challenge, but to facilitate it in an open way where all sorts of students feel safe, and also lead by example, by also showing that also as teachers among each other, that you also discuss these topics and show that you can have your own opinions and your own theological views, but that does not mean that you don't connect with others or don't have a meaningful conversation. That you agree to disagree also, and that students can also learn from that and maybe be a role model in that regard. Yeah.
Okay, Martijn?
Yeah, I agree with the former two speakers. I only want to add that for me it's also very important to look for those stories, those Bible passages that conflict, so to say. So that helps also to engage with people who think that there's one truth or something like that in the Bible, to show them the complexities and the diverse voices that are in the Bible, whether it is about, for example, gender identity or violence or slavery, whatever. I mean, the Bible has a lot more to offer than we often think, or than the general member of a church often think.
A question coming from what you three are saying is, for instance, like you, Amatina, if you have to guide a congregation, they might ask of you for guidance, especially in a time of crisis. So how do you handle that question?
I think nowadays people find more guidance on the internet than under the minister.
For you.
Yeah, well, it's what it is. You probably will recognize that. No, but I think guidance is to be honest about the questions and to name them and to listen to people and not to just say, but that's the way and we all need to go there. And I think that's the best thing we can do, but also show them that we can trust God in that, and that I mean, trust in man. That's also a very biblical message. Actually, you will always be disappointed, and I think also in times of crisis, we see that people. Will put their hope in other people, in politicians or in whoever, leaders, and I think that's dangerous. And I think that's, we as a minister, I find it important to show people to trust in God and not to look at me for guidance, but what I can do is just listen to the questions and look for important things that can help us, and just to try to live with that and always have that perspective of hope, and how that, like I said before, I don't know always how that will look like, but I trust in that, and I think that that can help people, that people see that you can actually ask questions, but you never sort of are fully hopeless.
No.
And when I was a student, there was the other student of, I was in the same class, and he actually said, like, we humans don't have the truth, but the truth has us. And that always stuck with me, and sort of that helps me just to live as a believer and to give people guidance in that it's
Yeah.
not about...
Guiding people to find the way themselves, that's what you're saying.
Yeah, or find their way to God, I
Yeah,
think. In
as
this,
a community
yes,
as well.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, further questions? I see a raised hand.
Thank you. I'd like to hear a bit more about the other part of the title of this conference. What happened to the negotiating the good? Because it sounds very inclusive and guiding and people find their way. And, well, what happened to the negotiation? And where should it be or shouldn't it be, perhaps?
You're referring to negotiating the
The
good life?
the good life.
Okay, right. Okay, is there any negotiation in the good life? And who are you negotiating with?
Well, I guess there's absolutely a form of negotiating going on there, but and I think there are a lot of actors that you are negotiating with. So for me, for example, a tradition is of course also very important. So I just spoke about reading the Bible. How do you do that? Making the right, just decisions. And it is rather superficial, so to say, just to look at the plain meaning, whatever that is, of the Bible. You have to also be in conversation. Maybe that's a better word than in negotiation, but anyway, in conversation with your predecessors, in conversation with the church as a whole, in conversation with past theologians, past thinkers, past etc. But also in conversation with the community that you are part of. I think that's very important because we've seen examples of this morning. I found it really beautiful, the ideas of contextual Bible reading, that you need those people around you to find new meaning in these very well-known texts. Because you're not alone to refer to that, you're part of a community, you're part of a bigger whole, of a church, whatever that means. So for me, it's all about conversation with all kinds of agents, actors, artifacts, history, etc.
Yeah, thank you. Tabitha? No. Amatina? Say something about, well, you can say something about business administration. Of course, always nice to make parallels and draw lines.
Well, yeah, I have classes about negotiation, but that's more about finding
the best
common
price
ground.
for your
looking
shares.
looking further than the price and what is the interest of both parties, and how the classical example of a pineapple, and the one wants the fruit itself and the other wants the shell. And how can you divide it in a way that both profit from it?
But are there any examples or maybe principles you learned in business administration which can be applied in theology when it comes to negotiating? Or is that maybe too far-fetched?
Well, I think also in negotiating you have to look further than the superficial layer, than only discussing what do you want, what is the price, and also in theology you can say looking further than the superficial, like, no, I read this in this text, this is my interpretation and it is your interpretation, and looking beyond it, how did you come to that interpretation, what are the assumptions that you make, what theological assumptions are behind that, and maybe we strive for the same thing in the end, but do you need to pull off all these layers to find that and to discover that?
If I may add, I guess, but I'm not in business administration, that for a good negotiation you have to establish a relation. Yeah. So I think that's a very important part of answering the question.
Yeah, it always comes back to relations and community.
And maybe add on that, and I find it also in my own practice quite important, is that you have an equal relation and that you sort of respect the other as the respect you want for yourself. Because I see lots of times Christians or theologians are discussing something, there's an equal situation that they feel like you, because of who you are, your gender or your background or your denomination, you're sort of already in another position, and that's I think then you can never have a good negotiation. So I think that's quite an important thing to have, that equality.
Thandi spoke maybe about more than equality, about the rich needing to be guided by the poor in order to find justice. How does that fit in the negotiation question?
Yeah, I think that goes a step further.
Yeah, it does.
But then first you have to negotiate about equality. Are we equal, indeed? And are the poor and the rich equal? No, they are not. And the Bible indeed goes a step further and says, but then we must go further and just look at systems and where you can do justice. But that asks a lot of people, and that's very difficult, and we must not underestimate the complexity of it, I think. But indeed, that is the ideal, and I think we must strive for that, and we must ask ourselves what may it cost, you know, about the whole climate crisis and refugees and everything. What moral issues are we? Do we want to share what we have and may it cost us something? And I think that goes quite far, and that's not.
Yeah.
There are no easy questions then and no easy answers.
No, Tabitha, and then maybe
maybe to summarize, I think that an amateur negotiator thinks that he or she has to have the best for himself, and then a better negotiator thinks, well, maybe the best outcome is a win-win, and maybe a Christian negotiator would be most satisfied if he can also lose something, or yes, also willing to give something up.
Maybe that's a good addition for the business administrators. Thanks. Are there more questions or remarks? Or yeah, the microphone is coming to you.
I want to go back to something that Almatine said. You said it's dangerous to put your trust in man, and you should put your trust in God. But isn't that equally dangerous, or can it be equally dangerous, for example, during the pandemic, to say only we have to trust in God and we will be okay? I think that would not be enough.
I agree. That's very dangerous. But I think what I meant by trust is more that you actually don't know what to do. And some people are using their trust in God to know exactly what to do or not to do. And yeah, there's a big difference between that. That I think that yeah, with the vaccination, people says, but you must trust God, and it's. Yeah, that's a very difficult. When I was Theologian of the Year last year, that was quite a story and an issue, and I think then it's necessary to have some self-knowledge, that you see that you can project things that you long for, maybe on God, and stop the conversation there, and so I think then it's important to speak about what do you mean by trust in God, and why do you do that with vaccination, but not when you arrive in hospital and get lots of medication, for example. So I think then, yeah, then you must have a conversation about what do you mean by trust in God. And in the way I meant it was more like you actually don't know everything, and you have your own responsibility indeed, and take that fully, I think, and not just sort of backwards that on God, and that He is sort of the answer on everything. And yeah, but good question. It's,
any of the other two would like to say something about this, or next question? Yeah, next question. Was there somebody else? Maybe last question, as we have 5 minutes left. One final remark. Oh, onto the left. Okay.
Is your name Bettina? With the red jacket? I'm sorry. Oh, thank you. Can I ask a clarifying question quick? Is when you said the poor people are not equal, in what sense were you talking? Money? Wealth?
No, I meant it when
Who's higher?
in society, the poor people are not seen as equal in many ways. If it's and poverty is a complex issue, but I think from a biblical perspective, they are equal, obvious.
Oh, I thought you were talking
No, but
hermeneutically.
I meant it how it's
That they were higher.
that we, if we negotiate, we think most of the time that we have equal conversations, but we don't have. If people are poor, for example, and they have conversations or need to negotiate with rich people, it's unequal because that's the reality is that that people, not all people are seen as equal.
I thought you were maybe talking about the preferential option for the poor that they may interpret better than we do.
No.
Because the Bible is a story about. Yeah, I just didn't know what you meant.
Okay.
Thanks.
Oh, okay.
I also
I'm glad you asked then for clarification.
Thank you. Well, dear panel, any last thoughts, things that need to be said before we close? You said everything you wanted to say? Yes? Okay. Well, I would like to thank you very much for participating, for actually being here, which is really good. Thank you very much. There are going to be some flowers for you. I'd like a round of applause for the participants. And thank you for taking part and for being here and for asking your questions, and wishing you a very good evening and a very good continuation of the conference in the coming days. Thank you.